and dabs. Recreationally important species would also be entrained, including California halibut, queenfish, California sheephead, various croakers, and turbo. So if somebody has to use a screen, we would recommend they go with the lower mesh size. We continue to support the use of the area production foregone methodology to calculate mitigation if required. Of course, if you go subsurface intake, you won't have to do all the studies, you won't have to do all the mitigation, you won't have to do the studies to show the mitigation is working, you won't have to go back and do more mitigation when it proves that it's not working. So I'd like to point that out. As with the power plant cooling water, defaulting the money going to the MPA process is not our preferred alternative. We would like to have the opportunity to be able to point out localized projects that may not be in an MPA that would actually increase productivity rather than just putting the money in the system. And now that it's 214 and you're collecting money from power plants, we'll want to have a discussion soon about how that money is being spent. Finally, just general support for the monitoring and reporting requirements, the brine requirement of no more than 2 ppt over background conditions. I have a lot of experience with diffusers. There should not be any issue getting a diffuser to get back to background in a 100-meter mixing zone. And the restrictions against placing desal facilities in an MPA or a state water quality protection area or where the facilities may impact those areas. We support those.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much. Ron Davis, Cal Desal, followed by Peter McLagan, Poseidon.
Thank you, Chair Marcus, members of the board. I'm Ron Davis, the
Good
executive.
afternoon.
Good afternoon. How are you?
Good.
Ron Davis with the Cal Desal. I'm here to start by, just like several of the other members of Cal Desal, to thank you and your staff for what has been a very open and transparent process, providing all stakeholders a great deal of opportunity to make comments. We very much appreciate that.
And that's not a dig at the fact that I haven't been really strict on the time limits today.
No, it's not a dig at all. I'm
I'm
going to
just
take
of a
advantage
mood to listen this
I'm
today.
hoping that to take advantage of your generosity myself. No, I'm going to be fairly brief. I'd like to also echo a comment that was made, I believe, by the General Counsel for the City of Dixon this morning. I send my emails pretty much during work hour. I get emails back from your staff at all crazy hours, so I just want you to know that they have been very responsive at any time and like I say, sometimes in crazy hours. So
Well, it's
you need to let them
everybody's
rest
trying to
it.
figure this all out
Yes.
together, and it's
And-
good public policy.
And we've been doing that too. So I've been herding my cats at Cal Desal, so we have submitted comments in conjunction with the Association of California Water Agencies.
Okay.
I'm pleased to report at this particular posted stamp in time, I'm still employed, having pushed that pretty hard. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail other than to say thank you again for recognizing that desalination is an important component of a water supply portfolio in California. I would also like to remind you of my comment on August 6th that the Cal Desal members are very supportive of the idea of a two-step approach for mitigation. We fully support the idea of allowing a project proponent to mitigate, develop their own mitigation project for their particular project, but we also very much support the mitigation fee idea. And we look forward to working with the State Water Resources Control Board and any other agency that would need to be part of a legislative strategy to try to set up the mechanism for that particular idea to work. Okay. We understand that you may not currently be able to receive funds or expend it. We need to sit down and figure out a way to make that work mechanically, then look at the step of whether or not that can be properly implemented. So we're fully engaged, and we're prepared to fully engage in developing that with you. And with that, I'd like to conclude with, again, my appreciation for the opportunity to work with you and your staff, and look forward to working with you further. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, Peter McLagan from Poseidon Water, and he had asked for more time, and I'd said 10 minutes. And then Dave Boland is next.
Good afternoon, Chair Marcus, board members.
Afternoon.
Thank you for an opportunity to comment on the desalination amendments. I have three things I would like to share with you this afternoon. The first is you have our written comments, and Poseidon supports the approach that this amendment process is on. We have what we are referring to as 5 essential modifications that we think are necessary to ensure success. So I'd like to talk about those 5. And then also, as the board is aware, the Encina Power Station is going to retire at the end of 2017. That likely means that the Carlsbad facility will be the first sizable project to be asked to comply with the amendment. So we're going to share with you what our approach will be as we go forward with the San Diego Regional Water Quality Control Board and assessing the alternatives for intakes and disposal discharge technology. And then the third point, I'd just like to get back into the discussion about screens and talk about some concepts there and some recommendations. So I have some slides here. Starting with the 5 essential points. The first one's related to mitigation. There are 2 requirements in the amendments that would render the 7-year investment in the mitigation plan for Carlsbad as infeasible, and we'd have to abandon the plan and start over. The first is that the amendments require that the facility needs to be located in the source water body. We think that should be a goal, but not a requirement. And then secondly, there's just a different approach to calculating mitigation acreage and some of the flexibility to enhance the productivity of the mitigation site that was adopted by the Coastal Commission and our mitigation requirements. Good public policy, go seek out higher productivity wetlands, is not available here, and as a result, our mitigation requirement would go up about 250% over what's already considered full mitigation. So we think some flexibility is warranted here. We've suggested how you might go about that in our comments. The next point, on the performance of the diffuser, we would also echo some of the earlier comments that a definition should be included to help the regional boards when they're addressing with the applicants what a comparable standard of a performance is. And we think you should spell out this level of compliance in the amendments to provide that type of guidance consistent with the recommendation that this is a preferred technology. Thirdly, brine mixing zone. Board Member Moore touched upon this in his exchange with staff. The 100-meter brine mixing zone is not going to be adequate for projects that are looking at flow augmentation alternatives, so it sort of takes you right back to a one-size-fits-all solution unless there's a procedure incorporated into the amendments that would allow a facility-specific analysis of a facility-specific brine mixing zone sizing consistent with the rest of the criteria you'd look at in comparing discharge alternatives. We think it's one of the factors, just like a site-specific salinity could be looked at, different screen sizes, et cetera. This needs to be in the plan to make it workable. And then on salinity standard, the salinity standard as currently structured in the plan says that you will meet a 2 ppt requirement measured against long-term natural background salinity, the average of that natural background salinity, and it will be measured as TDS. There's 2 problems with this approach that would suggest that there really isn't a 2 ppt standard, it's something less than 2 ppt. The first problem is TDS is not the the measurement technique used by Scripps Institution of Oceanography, for example, that has a 98-year record of measurement of salinity in the Pacific, and most others rely on conductivity meters and follow a specific protocol. TDS includes things that are above and beyond salt, so you're going to read a higher number, and your 2 ppt increment is eroded as by that difference.
Can I interrupt you for a second? Can you remind, I'm sorry, this is one I just don't remember. Why did you choose this standard versus EC? Is there, I know we use EC in the Delta, but is there a reason why that wouldn't be the way to use it?
It was
in
what
the
was
ocean?
recommended in the expert panel.
But why did they say?
I think it was just the units in which they did the toxicity test, and the brine panel had done the literature review, and most of the results were in TDS.
So TDS is a standard that was used but Scripps has done a different one.
Right, and staff don't have a problem with using conductivity. It's just going to be an issue of are we going to have multiple narrative receiving water limitations with different limits that would accommodate historical data in different units, or would we have people convert to TDS? So this is kind of one of the issues that is a little sticky at this point in time, but we don't have an issue with the scientific method of using just electrical conductivity. It's not an analytical issue in any way.
All right, all right.
So the second issue with respect to salinity has to do with 2 PPT measured against the long-term average. In the case of the Scripps data, 64% of the data points are above the average. So again, 64% of the time, you're going to get less than a 2 PPT increment. So our recommendation is that we should be measuring the salinity at the intake, the salinity at the discharge, and it should be 2 PPT difference between those two, ruling out any sort of man-made contributions, which means you would cap the intake amount, the maximum, at what's in that 20-year record, not base it off the average, but the actual. So that's our recommendation on salinity. And we've had a lot of discussion this afternoon about feasibility. I just will add one point. There are 3 decision makers that are looking at best available technology: the CEQA lead, the Coastal Commission, and the State Water Resources Control Board and the regional boards. 2 of those 3 already have adopted the definition that's on the screen. We recommend, for continuity purposes, that you all work under the same definition as well, so that there's a seamless process here and we're not getting conflicting decision-making out of the regulatory agencies.
And another question, I think I asked this, but I can't remember, and somebody referred to it, but I wanted to ask staff, or I could ask Fran, you were here, or John, or somebody, the once-through cooling, what was the meaning of that language in the once-through cooling policy, and why it didn't account for cost? I'd always assumed it was just a different thing than this.
There was
but-
actually a lot of discussion about how feasibility for cooling towers should be looked at. And the decision was made by the board that the cost associated with the installation of the cooling towers wasn't the factor that they wanted to be using. So they specifically excluded it from the feasibility definition for cooling towers. Under
Because they
Turkey.
didn't want to use a CEQA standard.
Because they did not want to have a discussion about the cost, since we were having widely different cost estimates being proposed during the comments. Orders of magnitude differences between different analysis on the cost. And so the board felt that looking at all of the factors that we had looked at, that it was feasible to include cooling towers. And so for cost-wise, it was feasible. And so they did not want that as part of their decision-making. It wasn't that we don't believe that costs are important, but in that instance, it was determined that they had sufficient information on the
To
general
make the
cost.
choice otherwise.
Yes.
All right, okay, that's helpful. Okay, sorry, that doesn't count against your time.
Thank you, Chair. So let's transition to the evaluation of the different options. We are looking at 2 different types of screened intakes, one with a diffuser, one without, and we're looking at a whole host of subsurface intakes. I think we spent a lot of time briefing the board and the staff on the open intake alternatives, so I'd like to just focus on the subsurface intakes for this afternoon.
Okay.
And this is the first one. This is a sub-seafloor infiltration gallery, size 2, process 300 MGD, coupled with a flow augmentation for brine dilution. It sits on 64 acres of Agua Hedionda Lagoon. It will require 200 million yards of dredging, 31 miles of perforated pipe, and the permitting and construction time frame is about 10 years. The fish that we largely entrain reside in the habitat where this facility will sit, and this facility will irreversibly change the nature of that habitat such that the gobies and the blennies will most likely no
But
longer live
you-
there.
This would be, this is what you looked at, assuming that all your subsurface would be there.
Correct. We're looking at offshore alternatives as well, and I thought today I'd focus on this one because this has got a lot of attention. The Fukuoka, Japan facility of the SIG in a lagoon setting where it's quiescent. So There are offshore options. We've spent a lot of time looking at those. We think there's difficulties with this site, but we will continue to explore them with the regional board.
You know, when you size something like this, you know, there's usually a driver that creates, you know, a greater footprint. Would that have to, what would you say is driving this, you know, in terms of the size of the ports, the spacing of the ports?
It's infiltration rate, Board
in-
Member Moore.
Infiltration rate through the substrate.
And I think the infiltration rates are 6 to 10, 0.6 to point, to 1.
Mhm.
I'm getting my numbers mixed up, but
That's okay.
we picked the mid-range of the engineering design recommendations on this,
Okay.
not the low, not the high, but the mid-range.
So the footprint in a more sandy bottom type setting, would the footprint for a 50 MGD facility be comparable to this, or less, or more?
Correct. It would be the same, assuming that infiltration rate is the right rate.
Okay. Obviously, something I appreciate, you know, the exercise of screening this, but that just recognizes sort of a screening level review, and that would
Correct.
need to be looked at closer.
Correct.
It's not the
Right.
We're
end-all,
not done with
be-all.
this analysis. I just
Yeah.
wanted to give you a flavor of what one of these would look like. You
Right,
can see
which
in the
is
orange.
helpful for the discussion.
Can I just ask a quick question here?
Yes, sir.
Your required water demand is 300 MGD?
Yes, sir.
And so that's the 100 MGD for the source water to produce 50 for the delivery. What's the other 200 million gallons for?
That's the dilution water for the flow augmentation, brine dilution, implant dilution.
So you would need, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, and I just want to understand, why wouldn't it be 200, since you would be not 300, since you would be taking out, concentrating it from 100 to 50, then to go back, you would need to go back that same amount, wouldn't you? I might be missing.
4 gallons of brine, seawater for 1 gallon of brine gets us to 40 PPT before we leave the site. That's our discharge requirement under the current permit. It gets you below the toxicity thresholds. So what we've replicated here would be something that would be consistent with the existing MPDES permit for the project.
Thank you.
So that's a good segue to the next one. Let me just, before I leave, the orange rectangular area is the footprint of the desalination facility itself. And just to provide some scale, in the easterly lagoon, just east of I-5, you can see a couple of jet skis with the wakes there, so to give you a sense of the size of this facility. So here we are. Whoops. This is a 100 MGD subfloor infiltration gallery. Same concept, but we've cut the flow by 3 because we're going to send full-strength brine out a diffuser, and that has its own environmental footprint that I'll talk about in a moment. But this is 23 acres, 600,000 yards of excavation, 10 miles of perforated pipe, 7 years construction and permitting schedule. So this would be tied to what I'm pointing at here. Could you advance the slide one for me, please? Thank you.
Okay, just one quick second. Why do you say it would be 7 years to get a permit?
3 years, we need to go through a federal permitting process with the Corps and just about everybody else.
Oh, because of
So
the,
we're
because it's
assuming
in a
3 years for the
estuary?
permits and
Lagoon.
4 years to construct.
Okay.
The construction rates, there's some details in your written comments that talk about assumptions about how many trucks are coming in today to haul the material out, how many trucks are coming in today to put in the new material, et cetera. It's, if anything, it's aggressive. It's in the eyes of our engineers, but we have provided those details in our written comments. So coupled with the smaller seafloor infiltration gallery, of course, is this diffuser system. We've talked a lot about this. I just wanted to share with you that within the mixing zone, the red box, there's about 120 million gallons of water stored in that box, of which, to get adequate dilution, 8 times that quantity of water needs to flow through that box, 23% of which is subjected to high stress rates, potentially lethal stress rates, according to information in the staff report. So that's 181 million gallons a day of entrainment mortality associated with this operation, if those numbers are correct. So just summing it all together,
And then, sorry, we didn't turn it off when we were asking you questions, so you have a little more time.
just bringing it all together, we have this table across the four alternatives we're currently looking at. You have entrainment from 0 to 281 million gallons a day. Marine habitat mitigation required from 26 to 144 acres. We think the brine exposure, where it says TBD, is similar for all alternatives, so we haven't tried to calculate that yet. Construction time is 3.5 years to 10 years, and then you have costs ranging from 64 million up to almost $800 million. Now, just one last thing I'd like to touch upon. Janine, can we bring up slide 15 from the staff report, or 13, please? This is the discussion about the screens. So we contacted Alden Labs, who by many accounts they're viewed as the world's foremost expert on screen technology and ocean water intakes. And so we have in our comments a letter from Alden Labs looking carefully at all of these citations on here. And I just wanted to talk about the first four because there's some information here that probably got lost in the literature review. But first of all, the Tampa Bay Seawater Desalination Plant does not have fine screens. It's getting its water from the third plant down, the Big Bend, Florida power station. So it's the power plant that's doing the screening. Big Bend has 0.5 millimeter screens on 2 generation units and 0.96 on the other 2. And the 0.5 millimeter screens only run on a seasonal basis. They don't run year round. Barney Davis in Corpus Christi, from what we can gather from Alden is they never did have 0.5. They tried 0.7. They failed. They replaced them with 1.2 millimeter on 2 of the units, and they're using 9.6 on the other 2 units. Big Bend, as I said, has 0.5 on 1 unit and 0.95 on the other 2 units, seasonal operation. And then there's the Brunswick plant. Brunswick has a very unique intake that's got this special design that keeps debris from ever getting into the intake, but once they get there, they don't have 0.5 millimeter screens. They have 1.0 millimeter screens on 1 unit, seasonal operation, and then the other 2 units are at 9.5.
Are the 9.5s older?
Older, I don't know.
They just might have ones that they've had a long time,
I-
and the
I think-
smaller ones are the more recently.
I think they're trying to push the technology, and then why they've done these installations requests by the regulators or EPRI. They're trying to achieve the objectives you're trying to achieve with the screen size, which is minimize entrainment, and that's where I want to go with our proposal for the board, which is we would like to see a similar approach in Carlsbad. Since we're likely to be the first through the chute, we would like to have the screen sizes at Carlsbad be both conventional, larger screens. Our operators comfortable with 5 millimeter, that's what they've used normally, but we're not wed to that number. But put alongside whatever that installation is, a 1.0 millimeter screen, and for the next 3 years, do extensive testing with oversight from your staff, and come back to you on an annual basis and report on the performance, both operational as well as marine life mortality, and do a thorough search here. And then at the end of that process, if the 1 millimeter screens are deemed to be feasible and working well, then we would propose to change out the other screens in a rational approach to replacement that would probably have something to do with our amortization schedule on the financing, because that would need to be preserved, but we're open to talk about all of that. So with that, just wanted to close with, again, a recap of our 5 essential fixes. We would hope we could avoid disruption of the mitigation in Carlsbad. We could define a performance standard for the diffuser in the document, include a process for establishing a site-specific brine mixing zone, base salinity standard compliance on actual salinity, and recognize measurement techniques, and lastly, incorporate the definition of feasibility adopted by the CEQA lead and Coastal Commission. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, Dave Boland from Aqua, followed by Garrett Hertel. from MRWPCA.
Thank you, Chair Marcus, board members.
Mr. Rowland.
We signed the Cal DSAL letter and kind of want to make sure that it's understood that there's a pretty unified effort on the part of the water community to preserve the opportunities for desal as part of the portfolio. A number of the speakers have made a lot of the points that I'd like to make, so I'm not going to make them. I'm just going to hit the high points and make it real brief. We want to underscore a few policy concerns we have with the effort. The main kind of cumulative effect is that it may foreclose opportunities for desalination projects that could improve our water supply portfolio and opportunities in the future. We don't want to do that, so we believe that the policy can be reworked. A number of the points that need to be reworked have already been mentioned. I'll highlight 3 of them. There are a whole bunch of them in the desalination comment letter by Cal Desal and Aqua. But the main ones of concern at a kind of high policy level are the idea of limiting design capacity to constrain the relative scale of desal plants. That's something that's just not, from a policy perspective, it's just not going to work for the water community. We've got a lot of different ways that we do our business. I think Ken Weinberg did a great job of describing it from the point of view of a local agency that's responsible for doing a lot of water management planning. What he said applies statewide. As you know, we've got a lot of considerations that we need to take into consideration as we do planning and movement of water around the state and management of water to optimize the opportunities at a local scale and to be responsible to the ratepayers that we are accountable to and to the citizens of the state for a reliable water supply. So those considerations suggest that.
Can I just, there's one
Yes.
thing, I understand that point of view, having come from local government, and you've heard me say over and over again, I believe in local choice and all of that, but it's not unfettered from the actual consequences.
No, and I think he made
So
a
I
good
just want to be
point.
clear, because
Yes.
sometimes people are saying that, and sometimes they're saying this will be inconvenient, which is exactly what the Once Through Cooling fight was about.
No,
So
we're not talking
recognize we're
inconvenience.
in a challenging position of trying to figure
Yes.
out how to give guidance on the ocean plan on something where we've actually made another industry
And
spend
that's
a lot
that's a
because it
deep
was deemed to
concern.
be such a big deal. So we're trying to accommodate that. So
That's
just
right.
keep that environmental
And
impacts issue in that list of things that
And
we're all
we're very
responsible for.
concerned about that linkage to the One-Through Cooling policy process because of the results of that process. And so we want to make sure that we preserve our opportunities. And I'm going to just go back to the California Water Action Plan to try to provide a robust, both environmentally balanced as well as a responsible water supply portfolio. And again, the California Water Plan that has all of these different approaches to providing water resources, and that the right way to do this is at a local scale through the urban water management planning process. Again, integrated regional water management planning, there are groundwater plans will be coming out. There'll be all kinds of different kinds of planning processes to identify projects that are feasible and to balance and optimize the investments that we make in different kinds of technology. And it's often going to be all of the above. It's not going to be a loading order approach, a stepwise approach, and it can't be prescribed from top down. And I guess that's the big concern we have, is that this policy is somewhat one-dimensional in that it looks at aquatic life and puts everything through that screen, to pardon the pun, and that is a real concern to the water community. So these guys have been very diplomatic about trying to say we want to work with you on this. I'm just trying to explain from a very high policy level that if we pick a particular winner and loser situation, and on that leads me to my second point about best available technology, again, you may have the authority to do this, but is it wise public policy? And especially given the extreme variability of information that's available on what best technologies are, and the information you've heard about screens and about subsurface versus surface intakes and so forth, making a judgment on winners and losers at this stage at a policy level, we believe is bad public policy. We just think that that's just not a good thing for this policy to try to do. Now, we could set a context for making those decisions and then see those decisions made and hold them accountable, as projects are brought forward, and maybe use the regional board process to do that. But to try to preclude and presuppose what the best available technology is at this stage, we think is unwise. So that's the second point. And then the The other thing is the feasibility question. And again, we have an imported concept of feasibility here that precludes one of the basic elements of feasibility as defined in case law and in practice throughout California now, and it's been described, by other speakers. But the idea of cost and using the public's financial resources responsibly is a basic element of public policy. And we would just believe that, again, for whatever purposes, this particular policy to artificially constrain or presuppose an outcome and remove cost is just not good policy. So those are the 3 points. I regret to be so confrontational at this stage. I think these points have been made in very diplomatic ways by the water community in all the previous speakers, but they are of deep concern. I will go even further to say that this is sort of precedent setting. What we're trying to do here is from a clinical perspective, you're talking about desalination offshore, but we've got brine discharge, we've got groundwater management considerations, we've got a lot of salt management challenges that we're facing in this state, and that we don't want to set a precedent through a process that presupposes outcomes based on information that we believe will evolve through time, technologies that will evolve through time, and commitments that need to be locally right-sized. And I guess that's the kind of the underlying basis for those concerns.
Great, thanks very much.
Thank you.
You do? Okay, we have 2 more. Garrett Hertel? Thank you. And then followed by Stephen Keys. Okay.
Madam Chair, members of the board, I appreciate the opportunity to comment. Wanted to thank the staff and the board for this whole process. It's been very well received, I think, by the community at large. Quickly, I just want to echo the comments of Orange County in the refining the definition of a desalination facility.
What organization are you with?
I'm with MRWPCA, Monterey Regional Water Pollution Control Agency. We also do significant water recycling efforts and want to make sure that the definitions don't constrain any of those activities. In that regard, I'd also like to have some clarification in the brine mixing zone and how it relates to the zone of initial dilution. And as the ocean plan stipulates MPDS permit discharge limits, how those 2 definitions coincide, I think would be beneficial for those of us that actually maintain the discharge permits for the desal facilities that would be discharging into our systems. So that was all I had today.
Great, and you have comments, or have you talked to staff about that particular issue?
I have not.
Can you just have a little chat now so they're sure they understand what it is you're referring to, whether it's something we can be helpful in the policy?
Do I need
I mean,
to
not
clear-
when we close.
Yeah, actually, I need to get
All
going.
right, we can just contact us after.
But I'll get in contact with you. It's Claire, right? I'll get in contact with staff and thank you, and make sure that those clarifications are made. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And now I want to turn, I know you need to go. Steve, was there anything you wanted to say before we sit down and read all the comments with that guidance?
Yeah, nothing too groundbreaking, just that, similar to what I said at the workshop, specific language suggestions are welcomed. We'll look through those very carefully. I think we relied pretty heavily on the expert panels that we set up with a lot of stakeholder input. And, this policy has been a long time coming, and I think folks have seen where it's going, in terms of what the technology is out there and providing some flexibility. I think staff's listened to the board members and listened to the stakeholders in this proposal. So a lot of the concerns we heard there by Aqua and folks, I respect them, but this has been at the front of our cerebral cortex throughout this process. And there's a need to to make a strong stand for protection of the California marine ecosystem. It's globally significant. It's a temperate ocean ecosystem that is productive year-round, and that makes it special on planet Earth. So we will make sure that we are sustainable and protect the ecosystem. That's as high as a charge as we have as the State Water Board. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Questions, comments?
I'll be quick. I spoke last time, and so I don't really have anything to add. To just really appreciate everyone being very specific in their comments. That's been very helpful. And especially in the area where further clarification is needed. We're kind of walking this tightrope between wanting to be flexible, but at the same time wanting to make sure people understand what sort of the rules of the game are. And so those comments that everyone made on further clarification, I think, is very helpful.
My question is to Claire, I think. This presentation on horizontal directional intake drilling, does that fall within your classification of subsurface? Is there any reason to change the subsurface definition? What I'm looking at is I can see there are going to be additional, particularly with interest in desal, there are going to be additional technologies coming in, and if subsurface is a prime area, our preferred area, we need to be able to accommodate whatever the new technologies are. So
Our understanding was that it was part of the subsurface world, and I think we just need to do a better job in the staff report, maybe dedicating more than a paragraph to it. I think one of the issues was, since it is semi-emerging, I think it was used in fracking, maybe, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's where it came from, and so maybe we just need to go outside of the world a little bit and pull in some more information and include it in the staff report.
And I was also impressed with the first item in the group letter that came in from the environmental community to make sure that we're focused on the goal, which, as Steve just mentioned, is protecting all forms of marine life, and so as people mix and match, as the regional boards make choices among the different approaches, it really is to uphold the goal, not to facilitate simply desal. And at least I was impressed by that. Thank you.
Right, thank you. I thank staff for all their hard work and the hard work to come, as well as the conversation is evolving, and I know some of the things we've heard today are the same things we heard 2 weeks ago, or that we heard in other hearings, but others have progressed and evolved as the conversation goes on to a finer point. And so each time that may seem to some of you like it's the same hearing, I actually think they've all been incredibly useful, and we still have a lot to decide and a lot of pulling apart all of those pieces. As inconvenient as it may be to those who work hard on one set of issues, there are a lot of set of issues that we as a people need to bear in mind, and each of these efforts has to deal with the externalities that they cause. That's what the very heart of what we're grappling with here, is trying to set a level playing field, not have folks reinvent the wheel, but within a sweet spot where we are trying to balance flexibility and some sort of continuity or some sort of clarity and guidance. And it's not an easy thing to do, and it is undoubtedly inconvenient for people who would rather do something else. And so what we're trying to do is figure out how to lay out that playing field, and people have mentioned some cases that are challenging that we need to resolve, whether it's the Santa Barbara issue, some of Carlsbad's issues, but we do need to keep our eye on the ball in terms of all of these values being important, and that's the challenge we're going to have in the weeks ahead, and staff is going to need to go through all of the comments, as will we, and tee it up carefully. What?
We don't have any comments. You triggered something.
Oh, go ahead, sure. I mean, No, I just think it's challenging and it's hard, and anyone who thinks it's simple from any side hasn't been paying attention. So I'm encouraged by the folks who have actually come together to try and figure out how to resolve it, taking the long view, but also the short view. And I've been very impressed by people on all sides of this who are stepping towards that, trying to help us find that sweet spot. And frankly, that's the most effective advocacy there is when you actually look at what is it that the decision maker needs to decide based on all of the things that they need to hold dear rather than what's inconvenient for you. And I just thank so many of you for stepping up to do that, even though it's going to be hard to bring it to closure. It'll be easier because of the very thoughtful way you're approaching it. And staff, I can guarantee you, is a very thoughtful approach to thinking through each of these pieces. I've been very impressed with that. So.
I think this is for John, but it could be for other staff as well. There are some existing facilities or nearly existing facilities like Poseidon or existing facilities like Santa Barbara and kind of odd facilities like in Orange County where they're in a, kind of an estuary. How are we trying to create a policy that can incorporate all of these somewhat existing issues, or are we trying to set up a policy essentially for new home construction, for things that aren't there yet, or are we trying to do both?
So it's a little bit of both, but it's primarily we're trying to recognize at a certain point a facility is considered existing, and our regulations on intake only apply to new facilities. And so there is a tension. It's unlike what we do in other aspects of our regulation. Did you have a comment? Newer expanded, excuse me. I was taking the shortcut. And so it puts us in a little bit different position than we usually are, which if this is only discharge, we would set a regulation, set a time frame for people to come into compliance, and then they'd be expected to upgrade to meet that. But we don't have that same legal authority for an existing intake. And so we're trying to parse that very carefully and provide a definition of existing, which we have in the plan as it's proposed, and it includes a number of factors, and that puts us into this discussion with Santa Barbara, which we think we have worked through, and we'll let you know if we have. So this is the pieces of it. Then you're in a different situation with Poseidon and Carlsbad because they have to come back at once cooling stops, because their permit is only good for that period of time. So there has to be an evaluation there. So I might not be helping, but okay.
Well, I'm glad you asked that question because it's related to what I was going to talk about. So I brought this up before, and that is, sort of an ARB model where we look at a technology today and then also consider a technology review and what the future may bring dependent upon additional information that we receive, at some point later on in the future. And John, I appreciate what you just walked us through, because I'm remembering that the last time I brought it up, you put the skids on that because, once we make a determination, we no longer have the authority. So I was very intrigued by what Poseidon brought up today, and think that it's just an opportunity for us to maybe noodle on a way to do both, where there's a facility that is willing to undertake a pilot and make a commitment to do more once the information comes out as a result of the study. And I'm not commenting on size. Obviously, size matters. And the smaller, the better for the marine life, and the larger, the better for the facility. I mean, I guess that's, kind of the balancing act that we need to get to. But where I'm coming from personally on this is just, some awkward moments at ARB where maybe we pushed the envelope a little too much and we ended up seeing problems. And I'm nervous. I would probably move more in the direction of a smaller size, but I'm very nervous about having a policy that fails. And so I'm looking for another tool in the toolbox where we could, push the envelope as much as possible, but at the same time, have an opener perhaps to do more into the future. So maybe you could comment on what Poseidon, a structure like what Poseidon is suggesting.
So I will, but I want to remind the board that I do believe that we are pushing technology with the approach of saying that the preferred option is subsurface, and that people should be exploring the different ways to do subsurface, which is really pushing technology forward. There is a safety valve in that, which allows for screened intakes where subsurface isn't feasible. And then I'll get to your next point. What I understood from what Poseidon was proposing was a long-term analysis on the 1 millimeter. I personally believe we already have that from West Basin, a long enough determination to know that the 1 is feasible. It may be worth discussing with Poseidon 0.75 for analysis to see if that's feasible, and to be pushing that kind of forward.
Well, that's why I didn't want to comment on the specific size, because I don't know what those numbers should be. And at some point, maybe we're being protective enough of marine life. I don't know. But if there's a range where, maybe we could go further for marine life, but then it tips it to something that's maybe a little too costly, I just hate to close the book on it at that point.
Sure.
I'll look forward to the next steps, next briefing, and then what time frame you think, once you see all of the comments, and have to chart them out and help us go through it and all of that. I saw the timeline that you put, but on a finer point, I'd like to be able to sit down with you after I read the comments and read the comments relatively soon.
So we are having at least weekly meetings internally for staff, and then we can schedule weekly briefings if you want, where we tackle a little bit here, a little bit there in terms of the issues. I don't know how many comment letters we're going to get, but I can assure you that my management has assured me that we will have resources thrown at this to make this process go as smoothly as possible.
Great, great.
So my suggestion is that we give the staff a chance to go
sort
through
it.
all of them before we start
Right.
coming back and
Didn't I
commenting.
say that?
Yeah.
That was what I said. I was looking forward to figuring out what that was, but after they looked at it. 25 plus, all right, that's reasonable. Okay. All right, well, thank you all for your time, and have a good evening. Appreciate it.